Hi, and welcome to Santa Cruz Software Labs podcast. Today, we will be talking about the authenticity factor and specifically what it means for designers and marketing visuals. So, a little bit to frame the topic of today, we are more and more aware that marketing and advertising visuals are increasingly AI assisted. Or altered, and it makes consumers as well as designers a bit rethinking their process into consuming and creating this content. Um, a survey that Santa Cruz Software Labs did back in the spring of this year showed that about 98% of respondents said authenticity is very important in visual content. Yet, about 65% think that the solutions to confirm authenticity are not enough today. So today, to talk about this topic, very honored to have two special and incredible guests. First is Stephane B. Stephane is the creative talent leader with extensive experience with financial services. So obviously very, very acute on topics of authenticity and provenance and related. And Santiago Lyon. Santiago is the head of advocacy and education at Adobe's Content Authenticity Initiative. So let's start with a question for both you guys. In graphic designs and promotion, what does authenticity actually mean? Is it about truthfulness or transparency or what else? Stephane, you want to start?
Sure. I think it's about being truthful. I think from a user experience perspective, right? We all go on social media every day. We all go online every day. And there is this intuitively this emotion we get now when we look at content where we first can get excited by something that's beautiful or something that seems very genuine. And then right after, at that second, there is this idea like, oh, is this real? And I think that's one of the biggest aspect that is causing people to talk about authenticity today. So I don't think any images being touched is new, right? We had image editing has been a huge topic for the past 20 years, especially in the fashion industry and ad campaigns. It is nothing new, but it was still produced by humans. And so I think right now we are extending the idea of truthfulness in the visuals because it's like has it been produced by people? Is it a genuine moment that I'm looking at? And I think there is a huge variety, obviously, of visuals we can discuss from photography. I know Santiago will cover that more than I will, but we need as human, I think, to feel that we are being fed truthfulness, facts, things that are not made up. And so I think AI, in a weird way, has like been exponentially adding to our awareness of authenticity that maybe we didn't have as much before, even though we had a lot of tools to edit, retouch, change things. So I think that's my part on that.
Santiago, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we've entered an era of doubt. We're no longer sure about what it is we're looking at because of advances in AI and particularly generative AI. And it's creeping into our lives. It's becoming normalized, and more technologies are adapting it. And so as a result, the consumer is not sure what they're looking at. And that has ramifications across a whole variety of industries and practices. And I think consumers are interested in understanding the answers to those questions. Is this real? Where did this come from? What is going on here? Which is why the area that I'm working on around provenance is becoming more relevant. So, as Stephane said, altering imagery is nothing new. It's been going on for decades, manually first, then digitally, and now of course, using AI. The difference, as she indicated, of course, is that that was all done by humans. Now machines are taking over. And while machines are trained on previous human behavior, it's different because there's an autonomy now that's starting to creep in. And so it's certainly a very interesting time. But at the same time, I think it's raising a whole bunch of what I would characterize writ large as safety concerns. Is this legitimate? Is this safe? Can I trust this? And that's the world we live in.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting as a user I think there's a little shift that has happened where you will look at something and just be like, oh, this is innovative, or this is inspiring, or I'm feeling like somebody's sharing something a special moment that was captured at a very specific moment in time. And really it really kind of slows down, right, that moment where you feel that emotional aspect of being a user of visuals, that suddenly creep in and be, is what I'm looking at real? Is that true? And I never had personally as a user the awareness of that before. And it really feels like a slow motion part of that experience that I don't know if we can go back from that. Actually, it's really interesting. But
So Stephane, on a designer point of view, when producing banners or layouts, does authenticity feel like a creative constraint or an opportunity?
uh, I think it's both. To be honest with you, I think I think down the road, what we do is we're telling stories. We're storytellers. It's about narratives, and so it's about how you use visuals to that effect. Um, and at the end of the day, right, there's ideation. It's the idea and the execution. Those are the two big aspects. And so the execution is where now AI is going to play a bigger role. Um, and we are battling with the idea of ideation is still ours, right? So I am telling AI generated tool to actually produce my idea that was human generated. So it allows obviously a designer to maybe produce something obviously faster, um, to enable that same artist and talent to actually share that idea in a more in a clearer way with their art director, creative director, maybe even the client themselves, quicker, and saying, see if it's the right avenue for that idea to be produced, instead of putting a lot of hours, man hours, to produce that same idea. That being said, I think for me, uh, I think there is a pride that also comes in the designers, and I've managed a lot of them and mentor them. There is a real pride about the skill set, the hard work that you have put through the years to become the person, the go-to person for a specific skill set. Is that now disappearing? Because, well, all I have to do is have an idea and go ask an app to actually produce it for me. And I don't need to actually put in the hard work that it took all the way until now to actually be able to produce, to execute that idea, right? Because ideas, everybody has ideas, but the quality and the strength it took to actually execute that idea is now disappearing. Is it? And how is it affecting designers? I think it is affecting designers. I'm seeing it directly with people I work with. So I think that there is that human aspect that is being touched.
So that's interesting. So do you think that solving concerns about authenticity and provenance at the same time will restate that pride and skill set that you're mentioning, and that this actually completes a completely circle where um, the intervention of the human becomes essential and more advertised, basically, when you're consuming a content.
That's right, because currently I think we say, oh, this was AI generated. And so your first thought is like, oh, well, nobody, that designer, that talent, that artist didn't make it. I think with Provenance, we're able to now define what aspect of that image you're looking at, and it can be an ad campaign, it can be video, just a photo, has been produced by the human versus been helped, because I still think AI is a tool to help the designer to finally produce his idea, right? So I think if we can define that, because currently what's happening, the second you see AI generated, you just think it's somebody dropping up a prompt and then doing submit, and then you're getting a result. And you might be editing, like, oh, I need to rework my prompt a little bit, but pretty much it's like you could do it without being a designer, right? So this is a bit, I think, what is going on in people's mind right now. It's about knowing how to use the tool. It's not about knowing how to be a designer.
Thank you for that, Santiago. We're talking a lot about editing and transforming AI assisted. I know from your background as a photojournalist and head of photography for Associated Press, that must ring a lot of bells in your head. So we know that in marketing, images have always been somewhat arranged and dialyzed. So what do you think, or what would you say is the acceptable boundary between manipulation or no manipulation that respects or undermines authenticity?
I think it varies according to the field that you're in. As you point out, the area of advertising and commercial photography is often a construct with a view towards selling or marketing a commodity. In the world of journalism, which is my background, it's all about authenticity, and imagery is meant to replicate the scene as the photographer saw it, understanding that the human eye is a lot more sophisticated than a camera sensor. So it's not uncommon for images in the world of photojournalism to be slightly altered or retouched in order to replicate what the photographer saw. But then it really becomes a question of degree. In other words, the rule of thumb was sort of twofold. One, you shouldn't add or subtract pixels. And if you are going to play with the tonality of an image, it should be true to the reality as perceived by the person who was there. And if you notice it, in other words, if it's clear that something was done, then you've gone too far. And so it really becomes down to a question of judgment. And then I would say one of the harder things that we're wrestling with in this space of provenance is this notion of what constitutes a material change. In other words, if I use editing software that might have AI in it to make a sunset picture a little bit more red or orange or saturated, because that's how I saw it, that's a fairly innocuous change. However, if I am to put my head on someone else's shoulders or vice versa, that's a significant change. And so what's the threshold? And I think that's going to be a difficult target, because what we're seeing, of course, is the use of these technologies is becoming normalized. And as a result, people's perception of them is, over time, I believe, going to become normalized as well. And so it's a hard needle to thread, but I think ultimately there are probably going to be different applications and ramifications of all of this for different industries. Some industries are going to be very hard and fast about no change whatsoever. The financial industry, or things involving very discrete, quantifiable quantities of things, whereas other industries that are more creative are going to be at the other end of the spectrum. And it's I think gonna vary over time as we see how these technologies adapt and what the purpose of the technologies is for different areas.
I think
Stephane,
can I jump just on something that Santiago
sure,
said?
of
I think
course.
when it comes to journalism, to me, the word that always comes to, and I'm not even going to say to my mind, I'm going to say to my heart, is deontology, right? Is it doing the right thing and following a set of guidelines that maybe not written down, but we know are linked to morals and values and are right? Because as a journalist, I think obviously your uh, ultimate job is to bring the truth. We're back to truthfulness. And so how is this kind of being mirrored when we create visuals? I think that's kind of what we're trying to discuss. And there is the deontology from the producer perspective, like either the photographer, the designer, etc. But to Santiago's point, is also how is it being received by the user? Does the user have a responsibility to question what they see, or do they just eat it up without questioning anything, and on top of that start taking the responsibility for forwarding it, reposting it without even looking if it's truthful or not, is it real or not, is it factual or not? So I think there are responsibility on both sides.
So to follow up on that, and to what Santiago was talking about, since your expertise, Stephane, is in financial services, how does that um, industry deal with issues of authenticity currently, and is it enough? Is it capable of handling, like we're saying, AI assisted or AI generated content? What are the practical tools, approach, boundaries that are being applied in that industry, in the marketing field currently?
So it's from my experience, it's a little tricky because most creative teams in financial sectors are uh, vendors. So they are not directly working for a company, which add another layer in terms of risk and compliance. We deal with risk and compliance departments all the time, and we are. I mean, it is kind of a known fact in the financial sector that we are always a few years behind because of risk and compliance being obviously very secure on what is being used. Licenses are very limited. Being able, you cannot just download anything. There are firewalls, a lot of protection from a technology standpoint does not allow us to actually utilize a lot of those tools. And then on top of that, whenever you do request them, as you can imagine, when you have a massive firm, the amount of layers to get authorization is immense. So it's very difficult, and we need to be approved to work with tools at all times, especially. So my experience is more on the investment banking side, which means that we deal with non-public information. We need with IPOs and information that are not we're not able to share. So the level of confidentiality is the highest in the firm. So as you can imagine, when the public side is allowed to start using apps either produced or man-made by the company itself, or tools that have been approved from a licenses perspective, we still cannot do that. So we are really the last link in the firm to be allowed to use those tools. And it goes back to, again, I think in the financial sector, there's really this, maybe in health and finance is the two places where it's happening, where trust is obviously a very important aspect of the relationship with the audience.
So in another sector, we see more and more in e-commerce space, for example, companies not only using AI to beautify images, but also replacing models, replacing photographers, and sometimes replacing their product shots with entirely AI tools. So when we're talking about limits, Santiago, what is your feeling about that? Should legislation, for example, step in and say you have to make a declaration? How do we keep authenticity? How do we keep our relationships with the world intact, or not too altered, with that kind of systems in place?
Boy, it's complicated. The creative areas, not just photography, but writing, music. I was listening to some music the other day on Spotify that I thought was quite good, and then I learned that it was completely AI generated. It was a persona of a female singer, and the music that was being played, and this person had millions of monthly views on Spotify, so it was clearly being monetized, but it wasn't immediately transparent. In other words, what drew my attention was the biography of the so-called singer was very sparse. And so I went elsewhere to, Google the singer's name or the AI singer's name. And there it came up, this singer is in all likelihood AI. And so it got me thinking about how does this affect creativity writ large, and what ramifications does it have for all of the creative arts, given that AI can replicate it because it's trained on original, human creations. And so, in my view, there are sort of three pillars to this, right? There's the technology aspect of it, which is what I'm involved in mainly, but not entirely, which is the provenance, the digital nutrition label, the transparency, and then of course the adjacent area of detection, such as it is. And those things are very useful and fundamental to all of this. But equally important are the areas, in my mind, of education. And by that, we mean classroom education, media literacy for young people. We also mean societal education and also consumer education. And then the third pillar of this is legislation. And we're seeing around the world, to differing degrees in differing geographies, legislation being pushed through, whether it's the EU's AI Act or the Online Safety Act in the UK, or stuff that's going on in China or in some states in the United States. This notion of transparency and mandating transparency around the use of AI. With the EU's AI Act, for example, Spain has been quite vocal about saying that they're going to start to financially penalize folks who don't disclose the use of AI. And I think that's very useful. The question that I have is, though, that's sort of the equivalent, perhaps, to carry on the digital nutrition label analogy, that's the equivalent of labeling genetically modified foods at this juncture when AI is relatively new. However, as AI permeates everything that we do, it seems to me that it's going to need to be broader, and the labeling of content is going to need to be more thorough and more comprehensive. But of course, you can't just label stuff and expect people to understand what the labels mean. So there's an interpretive aspect of this, which takes us back to legislation. And then there's the technological resilience of it, which takes us back to technology. So I look at these three things as indivisible, as a sort of a trifecta that need to be spoken about in unity. The one variable, of course, that nobody can account for is our old friend human behavior, right? Because there are going to be people who will not care whether something is this or that. They're only interested in using things to carry on their own ideological mission or belief or whatever it might be. So it's super complicated, but I think that the work that's being done is encouraging. And I think that there is a path forward with the combination of those three things of provenance, education, and policy, or PrEP, as we like to call it.
It's interesting because you're saying we're labeling food as GMO, but actually we're labeling food as non-GMO, which means is it like everything's going to be AI, and then it's like, wow, those few things are not AI, right? Like those few things are not GMO. Is that going to become the norm, because it becomes like GMO is so default that you just mentioned when it's not, versus
Yeah.
right now we're trying to say, oh no, we need
Well,
to tag those visuals as AI. Is it going to be reversing course soon because of
it could
non?
well be. I mean, we've seen in the world of photography, for example, digital photography sort of became widely adopted, let's say, I don't know, in the mid 2000s, perhaps. And in the last, 20 years, there is a small but sort of resilient current of people who reject digital photography and are film based, and they like to do things because it's more artisanal,
Yeah.
it's more slow. It's like the notion of slow food in the culinary world as opposed to fast food. That exists in the world of photography, but it's very much a niche. And so I think the question for this conversation is, proving that you're human is going to be interesting. It reminds us of the 1980s science fiction movie Blade Runner, where the premise is that people were out there to detect bots that had come back from colonies where they were doing manual labor and were infiltrating the human society. So I don't know. We're going to have to see how all of this plays out, but I think transparency is at the core of all of this, and safety is at the core of all of this, and helping people make better informed decisions about what it is they're looking at and whether to trust it or not. It's not about truth per se, because that's a very weighted word and everybody has different truths. And we have to be very careful that, certainly in the field of provenance, this work is not perceived as big tech telling you what's true. That's not the goal here at all. This is about technology offering an extra layer of transparency so that you can make a better informed decision about how to react to something, which of course brings us back to education and policy.
I was just about to say education, actually, interestingly, is I think is the key, because I have a 13-year-old son, right? And I'm seeing he's slowly growing with AI. And so we have I feel like I have a responsibility as a parent, to make sure he understands how to think for himself, right? Like, because we have now this behavior that's developing on, like, well, I'm just going to ask ChatGPT, or I'm just going to, AI is going to tell me. And are we losing a whole generation of thinkers, right? And they're smart, but
Yeah, I
it's a
mean, it's
muscle that you need to keep feeding. And are we losing that because we're just, like, answers right there for you? It's easier.
well, you're also, I've seen some studies talking about sort of brain atrophy,
Yeah.
that people who rely on AI too much, their brain as a muscle of sorts is not being exercised, and so it's more difficult for them to act without the assistance. We don't obviously know what the longer term ramifications of all of this is going to be, because it's relatively new in its current form. But when you try and imagine what the future is going to hold 5 years down the road in terms of the adoption of all of these technologies and the manipulation of these technologies for power brokers, is also something that we need to be concerned about. The field of journalism, for example, was drastically changed with the advent first of satellite television and then with the internet, because power brokers realized that they could control the flow of information, making journalism in many ways a much more dangerous profession. Is there going to be something similar here, where these technologies are going to be controlled by power brokers with ulterior motives in order to manipulate people? Disinformation as distinct from misinformation, the deliberate agenda driven spread of false claims or false images to further a political or an ideological goal. Those are things that are of, I think, great concern, or should be of great concern, which is why it's encouraging to see legislation, particularly in Europe, where things are further along. But that legislation is going to need to shift to respond to the technological advances. And we know that technology moves at lightning speed and legislation necessarily lags behind. So I think it's going to be a game of catch up over time.
We seem to turn around around the concept that authenticity is linked to human intervention, and if there's no human intervention, then it's not authentic. But my question to both of you is, in the world of marketing, that authenticity is, when a company needs to reinforce brand identity, and we've seen it before AI. They can use a lot of different tools to make people imagine a world using their services or products rather than the truth or what happens when you actually use it. So how do we maintain this sense of authenticity without plunging systematically into the thought that, oh, if it's not made by a human, then it's not authentic? Stephane, you wanna tackle that one?
Yeah. I think there's been a shift in the past 10, 15 years when it comes to brands, right? We used to be focused on the product. Um, I grew up with Levi's jeans being cool, and we had all those, like, campaigns. And you have products as Coca-Cola, and campaigns can be really fantastic, either you like the product or not. And we have shifted really to care about what a brand's mission, vision, values, what it's standing up for, right? And either decide if you actually buy the product based on that. Either you like the product or not. Sometimes it's like, um, I love that product, but I just cannot stand by the choices they're making. It's even getting political, right? Some people are shopping specific places for their political standpoint. So I think there's been a shift on what we call authentic at that level, right? Because it's not about how realistic the realism of an ad campaign is. I think it's more about, does it fit? Like, do you walk the talk? Does it fit what your values are and what you're standing on? Right? We've seen this. Has been a huge talk about this, for June, in June, the month of June, and which is the LGBTQ month, and a lot of companies start using the rainbow flag in their marketing, social media, ads and all that. And if you were not, you would therefore be not being supportive of this group. And so again, like, is it authentic? Are you putting the flag because you will lose customers if you don't? Or are you putting the flag because the mission and values of your company are supportive? You have ERGs supporting LGBTQ, and I'm taking that as an example, but it can apply to a lot of different groups, obviously. So I think there is more of an awareness from a consumer perspective on where they want their money to go, and is it truthful to their beliefs?
Okay. Where do you think the responsibility of enforcing authenticity lies? Whether in a whole chain of operation, what is it at the camera side, for example, the workflow process, or is it at the publisher level, or is it the designer that reassembles everything? Who is responsible? Who should be responsible, if nobody is currently, for installing and making sure that that sense of authenticity is transmitted to the consumer at the end? Santiago, you wanna take that one?
Yeah, I mean, with regards to provenance, in other words, understanding the origins of a digital file, where it came from, how it might have been manipulated along its journey, and then ultimately sharing some or all of that information with the viewer, in order to make this work, and our goal at the Content Authenticity Initiative is to accelerate implementation of an underlying technical standard towards that end, from the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, something we call content credentials. In order to get content credentials to work in this complicated digital ecosystem, what we've been focused on are three different areas. One, the area of creation or capture. So we're working directly with hardware manufacturers, cameras, smartphones, and generative AI engines to say this is where this originated. And then the next area we look at is editing. This is how the asset was edited, what was done to it, how it was modified, etc. And then the third area we look at is publication. In other words, maintaining those content credentials and being able to display them in a useful way to the consumer so that they can have that window into transparency, that digital nutrition label that I mentioned. Now, capture, edit, publish, those being the three pillars. The first one is going to take some time because hardware tends to have a longer life in people's hands, and not all of this technology can be done with software or firmware updates. And so it's going to require, in many cases, net new hardware devices, which means that it's going to take some years for the totality of those hardware devices to be C2PA compliant. So the next area where provenance can start, and it can really start in any of these three areas depending on the use case, the next area where provenance can start is in the editing, to be able to say this is what I did in the editing and share some or all of that information. There, the issue is really around proprietary editing and the sort of secret sauce that designers and creatives like to use, not unlike what a chef might do, protecting a recipe, etc. So ultimately, all of this needs to be customizable to respect people's sort of proprietary practices. And then the third area, of course, is in the area of publication. And there are lots of dependencies there. There's the whole content management system ecosystem, there's the whole content distribution network ecosystem. And gradually, those ecosystems are coming to realize that it's in their interests to support the C2PA's content credentials and maintain their integrity. But then the other thing we need to think about is privacy and security, and not everybody wants to share all of this information, and often with good reason. So making all of this customizable, but having some kind of lowest common denominator that allows people to understand what it is they're looking at. So we're working in all three of those areas with obviously scores of partners in a variety of sectors, and each use case is slightly different. But what we believe is that provenance is going to become fundamental, table stakes, as it's sometimes called, for a wide variety of industries. The creatives are interested in it for attribution. News media companies are interested as it relates to trust. Gen AI companies as it relates to transparency, possibly in anticipation of legislation. brands are as they're interested in brand reputation, consumer protection. The law enforcement community as it relates to the integrity of digital evidence, the insurance industry, medical, scientific, satellite, federal communications, financial. I mean, it just goes on and on. And really what's driving all of this is what I started with, was this notion of doubt. I'm no longer sure, what's sometimes referred to as the liar's dividend. My payment for lying is that I call everything into question. So I think over time, these technologies are going to be fundamental, and we're going to look back and say, how did we ever live without these things? In the same way, we might look back today and say, wow, I remember as a kid getting into cars without seatbelts. How was that possible, right? So it's an ongoing thing, but I think progress is solid.
But you didn't give me somebody who's actually responsible, more responsible. Is what you're saying is the whole chain is equal responsibility? Is that your
I think from
position?
my standpoint, I can see designers. We've been adding through the years, right? More and more layers of information that from branding guideline, from file tagging, file naming, version. So there are a lot of like logistical aspects that designers don't love, obviously, because they just want to be creative and have fun creating. And then we adding all those layers, and I think that's just going to be another layer of. So that would be uh, a manual edition, right? So again, there is always room for forgetfulness and mistakes when that's the downside of human adding information. But adding another layer of making sure that a designer while work on a job defines, like has some meta tagging on what's AI, what's not, how it's used. I think that's one level on our level, what we can do to make sure that we have more awareness of provenance on what was AI generated and what was not.
In terms of responsibility, I would say that it's a shared responsibility,
Yeah.
but at this juncture, it's likely to be driven from the tops of different organizations or industries as it relates to their values and to their ethics, and what those values and ethics mean to their businesses. For some businesses, values and ethics are supremely important. For other businesses, less so. So I don't think there's a one size fits all here, but I believe that there is a collective
Agreed.
responsibility, but the implementation of it needs to be defined quite specifically. In other words, somebody needs to know what is permitted or what is allowed and what the consequences are of not following those guidelines, etc. I mean, when I was at the Associated Press, we did a lot of work around ethics as it relates to the values of that particular organization, which is, a major wholesaler of news for the ecosystem of journalism. And it got quite interesting and complicated at times, because we were telling people, with regards to manipulation of images, you can do this, but you can't do that. And then the question was, well, if I can do that, how much can I do that? And of course, then you get employment lawyers and unions involved, and all of that fun world. But I think writ large, these things need to be codified and need to be defined. And at the same time, there needs to be some level of flexibility that reflects the world that we live in and the changing technologies that are coming at us every day.
It's great. What I find very refreshing coming from both of you is that you see more the solution into a social movement of community people getting together and solving it, rather than waiting for legislations and laws and related to implement or force it to happen, which is great to see. We're coming to the end of our podcast, so give you some time if you have anything you want to add from the conversation that we just had. Um, you don't have to.
I would say encourage people to get involved, encourage people to be curious, encourage people to, inform themselves. The Content Authenticity Initiative, where I work, is a community of 5,000 or more members interested in this space. Many individuals, journalists, thinkers, scientists, human rights people, as well as many companies and business concerns. And being involved in the community means that you are exposed to more information about that and can think about it and process it and figure out how to participate. I think participation is really important here. And, to what we were saying earlier, this notion of, yes, this is a movement of sorts, a movement interested in transparency and interested in authenticity. And the more, the merrier. 5,000 sounds like a lot, but
It's not.
in the population of 8 billion, it's really not. So how can we grow that through education, through awareness, through policy, through advocacy, through technology? There are many different vectors. And when we do that, we elevate the conversation to one of societal importance, which I think it very much is. And we also create more entry points for people, because not everybody is enamored of technology. Often people are scared or distrustful of it. But, education and policy, there are often hooks there for people to get involved. So if there's a call to action here from my end, it's get involved, get curious, figure out what's going on. And together we might be able to do something.
Yeah, that links exactly what you said earlier, Santiago, about doubt, right? Doubt, to me, I link straight to fear. And so I think the best knowledge is power. The best way to tackle anything when you're scared is just go dive right into it and learn everything about it so you can master it. And so we can being master users of AI, not victim of AI. I think is really the key here. It's just not feeling like we have this, it's not a burden. It's not something that is gonna pull us away from what we love and what we know how to do. It can enhance what we do, do it faster, do it better, maybe, but still being controlling what we do. I think that's the key here for me to take away on that.
Great. Thank you, both of you, for accepting to talk on this vast and complex topic. Greatly appreciated. Thank you again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.